From the Atlantis Bookshop in London to the mystics of India and Egypt. Episode 1, The London Apprenticeship, 1898 to 1930. He was born in London in 1898 with a name he would later lay aside, Hyman Raphael Hurst, and a temperament he would keep to the end, observant, reserved, and not easily fooled. The city into which he blinked awake was a crowded argument of a place. Tram bells and hooves, fog and factory sirens, streets where tailors and hawkers worked beneath windows lit late by readers. He learned the city first by walking it. He learned himself by sitting still. A teenager taught by grief to look inward, his mother died when he was young, he began, quietly and without ceremony, to practice meditation. No Sanskrit mantras, no Sanskrit at all. He simply sat, watched, and noticed that the act of noticing changed the texture of a day. War soon interrupted. As a young man in the First World War, he found himself in a tank, a sealed iron room where the engine's judder set the bones ringing. Across churned fields, he learned another lesson. If a man can keep his head while the world shakes, the world is not the only thing there is. Peace returned him to London, and London returned him to books. He gravitated toward the borderlands, rooms above tea shops where theosophists lectured on invisible worlds, halls where spiritualists nodded at the thud of table tapping, little magazines with titles like Light and the Occult Review that made you feel you were part of a hidden conversation. In those pages, he began to print small, clear essays under his own name and under masks. Raphael Hurst, Raphael Del Monte, until the signatures themselves felt like a mirror game. The essays said, in essence, let us be curious without being credulous. Let us test wonder with the same patience we test a hypothesis. By far the most important schoolroom was a bookshop a few steps from the British Museum. It was a slender wedge of a place, shelves packed with alchemy tracts and psychology pamphlets, with devotional manuals, translations of the Upanishads, and new books from Ryder and Company. It was called the Atlantis Bookshop, and it became his counter, his pulpit, and his open university. A bookshop has a special weather. People leaned forward in it. Seekers and skeptics hovered over the same display table and argued with a politeness that could turn, in an instant, into a wager for the soul. He learned to hear the difference between excitement and insight. He learned how a good book can undo a bad habit. He learned to say, "Show me." He was married by his early 20s, a father not long after, and separated before the decade was out. The city had given him work, a child, and a craft. He was by then a nimble journalist with a mystical ache. He kept meat off his plate for reasons he preferred not to make a fuss about, an ethic, not a badge, and discovered he was better at concentration when he ate simply. He loved tea. He disliked pomp. He had a taste for clean sentences and clean motives. That is the map in outline. The ground was more intricate. London between the wars was a patchwork of small societies. Psychical research circles where respectable physicians tried to measure the unmeasurable Buddhist lecture series in drafty halls, theosophical lodges with bamboo chairs and plaster lotuses, and spiritualist churches where widows wept and mediums held hands around tables that compensated for the rickety legs of grief. He went everywhere, asked everything, and wrote it all down. He found that charlatans prefer adjectives and that honest men prefer verbs. He learned that a soft voice could carry further than a shout, if what it said was true. On certain evenings he would leave a lecture, say on karma or clairvoyance, and walk deliberately past the British Museum reading room, as if to remind himself that the mind has libraries as well as longings. Sometimes he went in, took a place under that blue-green dome, and read translations of Hindu, Buddhist, and Stoic texts. The pages refreshed him like cold water. He came to respect people who asked very old questions with very clean tools. He also came to respect the London bus. His meditation was not a theatrical ritual. He slipped it into the creases of a day. 5 minutes before a meeting, 10 minutes on a bench at Russell Square, a quick inward turn while the conductor clanged the ticket punch. He tested what he was reading against what he could do with his own attention. If a method required a Himalayan cave to work, he suspected it. If it worked amid the city's racket, he kept it. At the Atlantis Bookshop, he learned a craftsman's virtues. A customer would ask for a book on alchemy. He would reach up, blow dust off a spine, and, while his hand delivered the volume, his curiosity delivered a question. What do you hope to find in it? The answers taught him something fundamental. People come to these subjects not only for knowledge, but for relief, from grief, from boredom, from the flatness of a secular day. He learned to honor the ache without indulging the fantasy. Every afternoon trained his ear. There was, of course, the other London, the one of pubs and football chants and droll shopkeepers. He liked that London too. It kept him from thinking that the only serious business is metaphysics. He listened to butchers and buskers. He watched the street charades of men selling miracle liniments and tried to see how showmanship worked. That too taught him to be careful with wonder. A man who can make a crowd sway with a joke can also make a crowd bend its knees. He kept his body spare and his habits plain. He discovered that too much food made the mind woolly, and that, inversely, a clear day's eating gave the attention a clean edge. He did not argue about diet. He chose it, then got on with the work. He decided that the best tests of an idea were time and consequence. If a practice made him more honest and less vain, it passed. If it inflated him, it failed. Now and then he drifted across more flamboyant thresholds. Nights with stage magicians who showed him tricks to keep him honest. Suppers with men who quoted Plotinus as easily as psalms. A few evenings with older seekers who had burned through enchantments and reached the grain of the thing. Those were the evenings that sent him home to the notebook with the feeling that life, properly lived, is not exhausted by its surfaces. What he lacked, he knew, was contact, not with organizations, but with individuals who lived the questions without hucksterism. He had read ancient dialogues and could feel the breath still warm in them. He wanted to sit across from someone who could answer a question without reaching for a halo. He suspected that if there were such men left in the world, they were not on museum steps or speakers' circuits. They were where they had always been, in quiet places, in unpainted rooms, found by rumor more than by advertisement. So he arranged his affairs, tidied up his obligations, said what needed saying, and listened for a signal. In the last months of the decade, signals gathered, letters from India with names that hummed, travelers' tales of yogis who wasted no words, the repeated mention, from unrelated lips, of a sage in the south who sat in silence and somehow spoke louder than any sermon. If you had asked him in 1929 what he wanted next, he might have said, "To see for myself." Books had prepared him. London had trained him to listen and to test. But living teachers are not kept in museums or in Bloomsbury cabinets. He would have to go to them. He would have to leave the shelves he loved and step into the high, humid air of another world, where rumor said that sages still lived and that one of them, in the south, sat in silence and somehow spoke. In the spring of a new decade, he bought a ticket east. Second class, a trunk tied with rope, notebooks nested in shirts, and the city he loved watched him go with the tolerant shrug London gives to people who need to try something difficult far away. Episode 2, A Ticket East. India rehearses its mysteries, 1930 to 1934. India arrived all at once, heat that tugged at the breath, sweet tea poured from a height, a crush of bicycles, the iron-smelling flavor of train stations. He kept his reporter's kit, pencils, a small camera, the habit of a date and time neatly penciled at the top of each page, and he kept his London vow not to be gullible. He would see fakirs who lay on beds of nails. He would hear of saints who had not eaten in years. He would take none of it at face value and refuse to sneer. The first weeks were instruction in scale. The sky itself felt larger. Train journeys ran like sentences with too many commas. Stations were punctuation marks. Madras, Calcutta, Pune, Nasik, each with its particular grammar of smell and sound. He practiced moving from the grandeur of temples to the intimacy of one person's story without losing balance. In a city of 1,000,000 hearts, the work is always one conversation at a time. Calcutta introduced him to a gentle schoolmaster who had sat with Sri Ramakrishna and who spoke of the heart as if it were a room anyone could learn to enter. The schoolmaster's house smelled faintly of soaps and sandalwood, Pupils slipped through courtyards as if avoiding the echo. Here the talk bent toward bhakti, the love that dissolves the knotted life into a larger life. The visitor listened, asked, and did not argue. He had left London to hear people speak from experience, not to impose his own. Pune brought him an old woman revered by Muslims and Hindus alike, her eyes at once fierce and maternal. He watched her followers approach with garlands and the grave courtesy of people who know they are stepping into a charged field. Her presence felt both domestic and immense, as if the ceremonies of a family and the ceremonies of the cosmos had found a handshake. When he left, the smell of flowers followed him out into the dust, clinging to his sleeves like a chastened memory. Near Nasik, he met a young master whose silence had become his signature. Hundreds traveled to see him, and many saw in him a living Christ. The rooms were tidy, the discipline brisk, the devotion intense. As he watched the master's followers, he noted the human hunger to belong, a hunger that can, at its best, refine a life and, at its worst, dissolve a conscience. He took care to record both possibilities. He had learned in London that charisma is a magnet. In India, he learned that magnetism can line a compass needle or bend it. The rituals, the posture, the hush of those rooms, each impressed him differently. He learned to recognize the sound a group makes when it believes. It is not chanting. It is a soft agreement that runs like a current under ordinary speech. He also learned the sound a group makes when it is trying to make itself believe. That sound has a squeak in it. He wrote both down with equal sympathy. He wrote at night on hotel stationery and on the backs of railway timetables. A candle guttered in a saucer. Lizards clicked along plaster walls. The fan whirred like a tired sermon. He wrote the voices of men who insisted that breath controlled the mind and of others who insisted that God did. He wrote the tricks of conjurers and the tricks of the psyche. He tried, line by line, to separate spectacle from sign. A man can pierce his flesh with hooks and walk without bleeding. Another can keep his attention on a single point until the mind goes glassy. Which is the miracle? He refused to rush the verdict. India did not offer itself as a single lesson. It resisted him, and it warmed to him by turns, which is to say that it educated him. There were days when he thought all talk of realization was a kindness woven over hardship. There were mornings when he watched a man pray and felt a hush that had nothing to do with suggestion. He kept notes on the two moods and looked for a third thing beneath them. What persists whether you believe or doubt? By the time he reached Madras, he had a new habit. When he was invited to witness marvels, he first asked to sit quietly in a corner. Attention, he had learned, answers questions you have not formed yet. It also tells you when a room is a stage. He found that 3 minutes of stillness, done honestly, can spare a man 3 years of confusion. It can also open him to something he would have otherwise missed. In Madras, after a long, courteous interview with a senior monk, a suggestion was made in the tone of a friend recommending a good road. Go south. Go to a town that sleeps beneath a mountain called Arunachala. There is a man there who says very little and sees very much. Sit with him, the monk said, as if the sentence had another half it did not need to speak. The train south worked its way through rice fields and thorn trees. Vendors set tins of sweets in the aisles. A woman with bangles full of sun handed a child across to a stranger, and no one thought to worry. The traveler found himself oddly calmed, as if the landscape had agreed at last to move at his speed. He dozed, woke to sugar cane and red earth, and saw, late in the day, a shape on the horizon that did not look like a hill so much as a thought that had decided to become stone. At Tiruvannamalai, the hill rose like a dark, slumbering whale above a city bright with temple towers. The main temple's gopurams stood like stacked riddles. The courtyard smelled of ghee and smoke. Not far away, the ashram at the hill's foot did not look like the palace of a saint. A warren of modest rooms, a kitchen, a hall with an old clock. People came and went without being told to. Dogs slept as if they owned the path. A basket of fruit changed hands a dozen times and never looked much smaller. The air in the hall felt oddly honest. So did the man seated on a short couch, white-wrapped, barefooted, his head shaven, a thin walking stick by his side, Ramana Maharshi. For a long time, nothing happened. The visitor sat. The man on the couch seemed to be doing nothing at all. It was only later that the visitor would say that the nothing had a definite feel, the way sunlight has a definite feel, and that it began to work on him like a solvent. He was accustomed to questions and to answers with adjectives in them. The question he finally posed was the natural question of a practical mind. What is the way? The answer was a sentence that sounded almost like a parable stripped of its story. Ask yourself, who am I? No cosmology, no theological scaffolding, no threats, no bait. It was a drill. It was also a mercy. Here was a path that did not need costumes or foreign words or a single coin. All it required was attention paid to the very instrument of attention. He stayed for days. He watched the man in silence greet peasants and lawyers with the same glance, accept fruit, cut vegetables, and demonstrate no impatience with his visitor's mixed motives. A boy recited lines and forgot them. The sage smiled. The boy remembered. A woman wept and could not say why. The sage handed her a tissue and resumed cutting vegetables. The visitor watched and felt the defense he had honed in London, that quick lifting of the eyebrow, go slack. It seemed inappropriate, in a room that did not tolerate performance. At night he walked back to a hut on the grounds with his lantern bumping a slow rhythm against his leg. The path was crowded with insects pronouncing their syllables. A cow in the next plot lowed like a cello. He set the lantern down and wrote, "A method without myth," then struck the sentence and wrote, "A method without extra myth." He slept sparingly and woke early, already curious to return to the hall with its strange gravity. Something in him had recognized the shape of his own hunger, and it was not hunger for event, but hunger for clarity. He had come to India to test claims. He had found, unexpectedly, a question that tested him. Episode 3. The Old Hall, A Quiet That Does Its Work, 1931 to 1934. He decided one afternoon to follow the instruction as if it were the last instruction he would ever receive. No elastic interpretations, no detours, no decorated paraphrases. He would do exactly what had been said. He sat down. He watched for the first flicker of the thought, I, the quick, shy pulse at the base of the mind. He asked, not with words so much as with a pressure of attention, who, exactly, was claiming that thought. When the thought, I, came again, he caught it earlier and asked again. There was no drama. The room faded slightly, as a room does when you begin to sleep, except this was a sleep in which he remained entirely awake. He learned quickly that the I thought is nimble. It can dress as piety, dress as defiance, dress as analysis. It can quote scriptures and furnish doubts. It can be humble and still insist upon itself. Every time it stepped onto the inner stage, he made the same move. Who is this? He did not argue with the thought. He traced it. Not why, not what for, but who. He did not descend into autobiography. He refused to let memory masquerade as identity. The hall helped. Silence has a social pressure of its own, and in that room the pressure was gentle but insistent, like the hand of a skilled physiotherapist. Men coughed less. Women fidgeted less. Children stared longer and then mysteriously settled. Once he saw a man arrive all grievance and exit all gratitude. He could not say what had happened between those poles, because nothing had been said. In his account, there arrived a moment when thinking itself simply ceased, like a candle snuffed between finger and thumb. It was not sleep. If anything, it was a startling wakefulness that had sloughed off the need to talk to itself. He would later write a line that became famous because it was not accompanied by a trumpet. I find myself outside the rim of world consciousness. No fireworks, no celestial choir, the absence of the unnecessary. The surprise was not the state itself. Mystics had described such clearings for centuries. The surprise was the ordinariness that followed. He stood, stretched, accepted a sweet from a tin, and found that the room came back without the old heaviness. People were not obstacles. Objects were not threats. He noticed that when a thought arrived in his chest and asked for attention, it did not arrive as an overlord. It arrived as an employee. He sat later that day with the man on the couch and, emboldened by the clarity, asked a sharper question. How does this endure? The answer, distilled through a translator and a smile, came back as the same sentence in a different key. The inquiry itself is the endurance. It is not a ladder you toss away after a single climb. It is the way you walk. He experimented. He walked the compound with the I thought in view, noting how quickly it attaches itself to a cricket of pain in the knee, a flash of irritation at a buzzing fly, a sudden pride at having been so wonderfully free of pride. He practiced laughing at the last kind. He found that laughter, used judiciously, is a disinfectant in spiritual rooms. It keeps worship honest. He did not take vows. He did not shave his head. He remained a visitor who knew he was a visitor, grateful and steady. His questions were simpler now and fewer. If a method could not be translated into the life of a man who must rise, work, cook, and sweep, he shelved it. The old hall had given him a filter. Keep what clears attention, drop what inflates identity. He watched, meanwhile, the work of the place. People arrived with troubles that the language of metaphysics could not honor. Debts, fevers, a bad son-in-law. The sage who had no program, no movement, and no fee schedule handled such facts without condescension. If a feverish boy needed medicine, he indicated the nurse. If a farmer needed a small loan, he indicated the man who kept the accounts. Compassion here was domestic, not theatrical. It was also contagious. The visitor felt more than once the urge to help without anyone assigning him a task. Sometimes at dusk he walked to the edge of the town. The evening bells sounded like firm hands on a loosened knot. He considered walking the full circuit of the hill, as pious people did, but decided against it. If the practice became performance, the eye would be back at the front of the procession, garlanded. He returned to the hut instead and wrote by lantern, "Keep the instruction plain." When it was time to go, he felt the ache that a good teacher leaves behind, a gratitude that is not servility, a respect that does not need to be carved in stone. He gathered his notes and his shirts, paid his respects without sentimentality, and promised himself a stricter experiment. He would test whether a method born in a hall could live in a city where beggars jostled copy editors and bills insisted upon themselves. Back in England, he wrote the book that would make his name and, more importantly, would make the name of the man he had sat with. He called it A Search in Secret India. He could have called it A Search in Public Rooms, for he had made a point of visiting saints whose fame leaked out of huts and into bazaars. The book told stories of yogis and wonder workers, of rooms bright with devotion and rooms rank with fraud. But it ended where it had to end, in the old hall with the simplest instruction. Western readers read those pages with the rapt interest of people peeking through a keyhole. Many later visitors to the ashram would report that the book had put the hill inside their heads long before their feet arrived at its base. They wrote him letters that said in various ways, "Thank you for not dressing it up." He answered as many as he could, and when he could not answer, he answered in the only way a writer knows. He wrote another book. He wrote a slimmer, more practical volume to follow, The Secret Path, that took the clear light of the last chapters and showed how to live by it at a kitchen table. He explained how to sit without vanity, how to attend without strain, how to test a day's work, not by how exalted you felt, but by how useful you were. He stripped the instruction of exotic names without stripping it of power. He was not a monk. He was a man in a jacket in a teeming city, urging other such men and women to sit still. At the core of it all was a respect that never dimmed. When he spoke of the man on the couch, he did not praise to flatter or exaggerate to recruit. He spoke as one craftsman speaks of another who handles the tool better. The tool was attention. The art was to turn it back upon itself. Episode 4, Stone Night, Egypt's Chamber and the Return to Reason, 1935 to 1936. The next book was a cousin to the first and a test of it. He went west to Egypt, that desert museum where the past looks like a future we missed, and he walked its temples with a pilgrim's patience and a skeptic's teeth. The new book would be called A Search in Secret Egypt, and its center would be a knight. The Cairo that greeted him was a confection and a construction. Minarets like lifted fingers, donkey carts that resisted the century, cafes where men smoked as if smoke were an idea. He prowled the Khan el-Khalili bazaars and learned fast the arithmetic of bargaining. He refused to look like a pilgrim. Pilgrims buy stories dear. Journalists buy them with exact change. He studied the tourist's route and walked it anyway, then stepped off it to find the quieter places. A small Coptic church with its icons soot-darkened by hands. A room where a monk mended chairs with a patience that can outlast arguments. He asked a priest to speak to him of prayer and learned that prayer and attention are cousins who meet often. He felt for a moment the gentle embarrassment of recognizing an old friend in a new country. He wanted above all one experiment, a night alone in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. That required letters, coaxing, handshakes, and finally the kind of luck that meets preparation halfway. The permission was granted with the cheerful threat every official learns early: break nothing, disturb no one. And at sunset he followed a keeper up narrowing passages until the world turned to stone and echo. He entered with a blanket and a thermos, a pencil, and the promise to himself not to make a novel of what did not deserve a chapter. The chamber's proportions fell upon him like an equation. The sarcophagus sat with the blunt dignity of a tool. He ran his palm over the granite and felt the skin's antique pleasure at a cool surface. Then he sat on the floor, arranged his limbs into a truce, and began the work he already knew. Watch the eye thought. The first hours were a small war with the body, numbness, pins and needles, a prickle across the scalp that put him in mind of schoolboy terrors. The darkness made itself an animal and paced around him. He let it, as one lets a dog pace itself tired in a garden. He learned again that fear, too, is a form of thought. The moment he recognized it, it surrendered a degree of its menace. Then came the clearer hours. The chamber's geometry drew his mind into its angles and returned it to center. The quiet became explicit. A human hush is different from a geologic hush. This was both. He practiced the inquiry, who am I? Not a litany, not a mantra, but a question trained upon the exact place where identity tends to hide. Each time an answer rose, he refused it. He aimed not for content, but for source. Somewhere in the center of the night there was a ripple, a pressure from without or a suggestion from within, it is hard to say which, that made him think of presences. He took note and did not embroider. He let the thought go, the way one lets a visitor pass who is kind and has no business with you. He returned to the inquiry and found again that it returns him to a space free of applause. Dawn is slow underground. First the air seems to change temperature, then the edges of objects confess themselves, then a keeper's lamp halos a doorway. He stood, shook his legs awake, and realized his surprise. The experiment had not given him new knowledge. It had given him confidence in what he already knew. The method he had learned in a South Indian hall worked inside a pharaonic machine. The venue had changed. The mind had not. Around that night he wrapped a travelogue. He rode south to Luxor and felt the tide of meanings rise and fall across columns that once seemed as permanent as horizon. He watched dervishes spin with a sincerity that fenced out spectators. He met a magician who could pierce his own arm and make blood hide. He noted the dangers on either side. To be so skeptical you cannot see, to be so credulous you cannot think. His way lay down the narrow street between. He allowed himself one shadowed figure, a quiet teacher who spoke of the inner temple, of rites that had nothing to do with lamps, and of disciplines that had everything to do with character. He wrote about this encounter with care and was rewarded with letters from readers who prefer their guides public. He answered a few with a gentle defense. Sometimes a private conversation must remain private to keep its dignity. The book made his audience larger and more contentious. Some loved him for bringing ancient sites to life without drowning them in adjectives. Others scolded him for not bowing deeply enough in the presence of mystery. He accepted both judgments as the cost of writing honestly. You pay for refusing to tilt the table. But a pivot had begun. The Egyptian book, for all its scenes and flavors, felt like a final experiment before a change of tone. He had shown himself he could sit in the center of a tomb and keep his head. Now he wanted to show himself something harder, that understanding the experience matters more than having it. He wanted to find a language that satisfied the mind that asks, "How is any of this so?" He returned to India for a time, then to Europe, carrying notebooks dense with sentences that began, "It is not enough." He had a sense now that to serve his readers he must risk disappointing some of them. He must argue for thinking, not as an enemy of spiritual life, but as its completion. Episode 5. The Hidden Teaching, Mysore, Mentalism, and the Long Argument, 1937 to 1943. War gathered in the background. He spent long months in southern India, often in Mysore, where the prince admired his writing and gave him the leisure to write more. In the shade of palace colonnades and in the homes of scholars, he absorbed a different education. Not the education of showmen or even of saints, but of men trained to push an idea until it rang true. There he came close to a Vedanta philosopher whose exactness he admired. With him and through him, he rubbed the lyrical edges off his language. A new vocabulary assembled itself with a click, like a carpenter's box completed. Overself, world-mind, mentalism. Each term had work to do. Each would later be misunderstood by people in a hurry. He took to writing definitions as carefully as he once wrote journal entries. Accuracy has a tone. He had found it. The overself was his English for the deepest identity, the witness of the mind, the light behind experience, the silence that is not the absence of sound, but the condition for meaning. The world mind was his way of talking about the order that sustains the world, the intelligence that refuses to be trapped by any single creed. And mentalism was the assertion that the world we meet is always the world as known, the world as experience, that whatever lies beyond experience is not our business until we have learned to handle experience itself with respect. He had written a practical book, The Quest of the Overself, for people who wanted to practice without a religion's wardrobe. Now he wrote 2 large books for people who wanted, as he did, to understand the structure of the experience itself. The first he called The Hidden Teaching Beyond Yoga, the second, The Wisdom of the Overself. The first book startled some who had followed him from the old hall through the king's chamber. It told them, in effect, mystical experience is not the end. It is not by itself wisdom. A trance can be as seductive as a circus. Without a rigorous view of mind, of how knowing works, of what self really is, mysticism becomes a long afternoon's dream. The second book built that rigorous view. It gave definitions, maps, and a place to stand. It did not, he insisted, contradict the old hall. It completed it. The inquiry, "Who am I?" discovers, he argued, not a pretty thought, but the structure of experience itself. The overself is not mood, it is fact. He wrote through blackouts and years when paper was rationed. He rewrote whole chapters because a sentence leaned too hard on metaphor. He learned to test a paragraph by reading it aloud. If it made sense to the ear, it could survive the eye. He kept the tone spare, and sometimes readers mistook spare for cold. But the warmth in those volumes is a quiet one, more like a steady radiator than a stove, a heat you notice when you realize you haven't shivered for an hour. The change in tone had consequences. He wrote with candor about the limitations of idolizing gurus. He wrote with exasperation about confusion parading as sanctity. He used the word philosophy a great deal, and meant something more muscular by it than the average bookshop browser. To him, a philosopher was not a man who collects arguments, but a person who lives one, truthfulness about what the mind is doing from moment to moment. He did not denounce the man he had sat with in the old hall. He never would. But he did push back against the institutional magnetism that can accrue around a saint. In the late 1930s, those tensions spilled outward. Managers of an ashram and an author with a stubborn streak are not a recipe for calm. There were quarrels. There were wounded feelings. There were years of rumor and retort. In quieter moments later, he would say, with the economy he had learned in that hall, that any criticisms he had ever made of the sage were regrets. The Mysore years also sharpened the ethic his students came to recognize. Keep to a simple diet. Do not make a sacrament of your plate. Practice daily. Do not confuse reading with doing. Admit that the mind is not the enemy. Learn how to use it. Do not collect teachers like stamps. Do not pretend to certainty. If a silence arises, do not make a museum of it. He spoke more often of the world mind, by which he meant the order that contains and gives rise to mind, and less often of phenomena. He seemed to prefer sentences that you could test at breakfast over sentences that made your scalp tingle. It was a long argument he was waging, and his opponent, chiefly, was the human tendency to turn a glimpse into a billboard. The books went out into the world like well-made tools. Some readers took them up and discovered they could work with them. Others set them down because they missed the incense. He accepted both results as the price of speaking plainly. He had chosen the harder kindness, to tell people that understanding must complete experience, and that the test of both is character. Episode 6, Quiet Years, Loud Echoes, Debates, Diet, Notebooks, and an End, 1944 to 1981. War ended, but his public voice quieted. He traveled, lodged in quiet towns in Europe, stayed near mountains in Switzerland where the air is thin enough to keep a thought honest. He wrote every day. He did not publish much. Pages piled up, dense and neat, paragraphs like joined beads, aphorisms that did not need a paragraph at all. In time, those pages would become the multi-volume notebooks that would introduce him to readers who had never once opened a search in secret India. He treated writing as a practice, not a performance. He would get up, boil water, sip tea, and then place a sheet of paper where the first light could find it. He wrote in longhand because pens slow the mind to a human speed. He made a rule that sentences must be tools. If a sentence could not be used by someone with less time and more worries than the writer, it did not belong. He began throwing out pretty paragraphs with the same calm he once used to throw out poor photographs. Visitors still came. Some were students who had begun with his early books and stayed to learn how to live by a few simple rules. Some were writers who had read him, gone to India, and written their own transmutations of that experience. An English novelist visited the old hall in the late 30s, fainted briefly, tired, overhot, moved, and later made a guru the moral axis of a novel. Brunton understood perfectly that literature does not reproduce, it distills. He had, after all, done something like that himself. He did not resent being someone's footnote if the book it served was honest. Other echoes were harsher. Men and women who had known him in North America and Europe told stories later that reflected the light at which they remembered him. Some remembered gentleness, patience, and the stubborn common sense that refused to let a student make magic of a mood. Others remembered edicts and a certain severity. In one household, a family moved to the far side of a hemisphere with their children because a prediction had shaken them. The children grew up and wrote books about what it felt like to be moved around by a father's faith and a guest's authority. The author in question became, for that son, a symbol of the danger of charisma in a living room. He did not answer such books. He did not litigate. He cooked simply, continued to keep meat off his table without turning the dining room into a tribunal, and preferred a quiet cup of tea to the coffee that seemed to make minds jumpy. His advice about food was the same advice he gave about meditation cushions and sacred statues. Use what helps. Do not become what you use. He thought fanaticism is what happens when a good thing escapes its container. He kept his containers modest, a bowl, a pen, a few careful rules. In his 70s, he still wrote tirelessly. The sentences became more distilled. He cared, obviously, about the state of the world, its wars, its loud certainties, its banal cruelties. But he did not believe any longer that a reader could begin reform with a banner. He believed a reader began reform by catching the collar of the I-thought and following it back, again and again until the collar was found to be a loop tied to nothing. It was a politics of attention, and therefore of ethics. A man who has caught his I-thought is less likely to shout at a waiter, less likely to misuse a newspaper, less likely to ruin a child's day. He aimed there at the small radiations of decency. His rooms were quiet because he liked them that way. A bed, a desk, a chair with a back that made slouching unlikely. Windows that admitted light the way a good friend admits a joke, freely, without fuss. a shelf of the few books he kept returning to, a philosopher who loved clarity, a poet who loved restraint, a saint who loved everyone because he could not find the seam that divides me from you. The rest he gave away. Possessions weighed on the mind. He had been learning to travel light since the days he discovered a notebook could replace a trunk. He liked to walk. Villages in the Alps, lanes in England, parks where children remind the old that time has a rim beyond which it spills into laughter. On those walks, he practiced inquiry without withdrawing from the day. He stopped to tie a shoe and sealed the knot with a "Who am I?" Not as a ritual, not as a performance, but as a way to reset. He discovered that the mind turns biddable when it is not forced. Occasionally, a friend would coax him to speak to a small room of people who needed a sentence more than a sermon. He would give them two. The first would be about honesty. You must notice when you are decorating a thought because decoration is how a thought hides its ulterior motive. The second would be about kindness. You must grant others the slack you grant yourself. If you demand perfection from them or from yourself, you will turn the practice into a corridor lined with mirrors. He knew he had made enemies as well as loyal readers. The enemies were necessary. They kept him cautious. The loyal readers were necessary. They kept him from loneliness. But he tried not to build a house with either group. He preferred to rent, philosophically speaking, to live in such a way that he could pack up in an hour if the overself suggested he move along. He died in 1981, far from the old hall, but not far, in any important way, from the instruction he had taken there at face value. Friends and students edited the pages he left and sent them into the world, where they have done the quiet work that good pages do. They have sat still on coffee tables until a reader with a sore mind picks them up, and then they have offered the simplest prescription in the world. Sit, notice, ask who precisely is doing the noticing. Do not be clever about it. Be thorough. The arguments still go on around his name. Some say he leaned too hard on mind. Others say he did not lean hard enough. Some treasure the night in the pyramid and the rumor of an anonymous adept. Others treasure the pages that discount the glamour of such tales and return the reader to the plain task. But across different camps, the same refrain recurs. He went looking for saints and found instead a question that does not age. If you ask what remains, picture him at a small table in a rented room. A kettle clucks. A notebook is open. He has written a line and then crossed it out, then written it again with one fewer adjective, and then drawn a long dash as if to warn himself not to gild it. He looks up. He looks nowhere. He looks, as he was taught, at the source of the looker. In that act, there is no London or Cairo, no Mysore or mountain town in Switzerland. There is only the steady human practice of turning attention back on itself until the pretense of a center gives way. The rest, books, rumors, reverence, recoil, belongs to other people. The work belongs to the one who is reading these words now, with a heartbeat for a metronome and a day waiting to be lived a little more honestly than yesterday.